Hello, my name is Sean Hoban. I work at the Morton Arboretum, which is near Chicago in the United States, and I'll be presenting on behalf of my co-authors listed here about how genetic diversity has been considered in national reports to the Convention on Biological Diversity. What are national reports? They're one of the main mechanisms by which countries report on their progress towards the CBD targets and also report on other relevant information such as threats to biodiversity, values of biodiversity, etc. They should be submitted by all parties to the CBD about every 4 years. They cover all levels of biodiversity, gene, species, ecosystems. They're highly variable in their length, with some much shorter and more or less detailed than others. In spite of such a caveat, they are one of the only global sources of information on what countries are doing to conserve and protect biodiversity, and they also reflect countries' priorities about biodiversity. We focus on genetic diversity because national reports have never been analyzed for their genetic diversity content. Biodiversity is composed of three main areas, of which genetics is one. Genetic diversity helps species adapt to environmental change, supports more diverse and resilient ecosystems, and is also important for food security and other economic concerns. Genetic diversity is declining and is known to be not very well safeguarded in situ or ex situ. Genetic diversity was an element of the CBD targets that were to be achieved by 2010 and 2020. Those targets are shown here. I highlight in bold that these targets did focus primarily on species of economic importance, especially agriculture, and then mentioned also other socially or culturally or otherwise valuable species. In our study, we wanted to understand how countries are assessing, monitoring, and protecting genetic diversity in this context of targets. And we hope to inform and improve how genetic diversity is measured and reported on in national reports in the future. We have a few specific aims. We first looked at whether genetic targets are included and other awareness of genetic diversity. We then looked at what actions are being taken for genetic diversity and what indicators are used for status and change of genetic diversity in the reports. And then lastly, we looked at what types of species is genetic diversity being reported on or mentioned in countries' national reports. We then looked at whether these results change over time or in different categories of countries. We used a standardized structured survey to achieve these aims. And we looked at 57 reports from 2014 and 57 reports from 2018, a total of 114 reports in 3 main languages. We found that countries are aware of genetic diversity. A relatively high number of countries mention genetic diversity tools or genetic concerns in their executive summary, if that's included. And a majority, but certainly not all countries, have a national target corresponding to the current Aichi Target 13 or previous genetic targets. We also find that many countries are, moderate number of countries are mentioning genetic diversity or tools with respect to other targets, such as targets for species diversity, knowledge, or technology. As far as indicators go, we show here a number of possible indicators countries could be using, both formally recognized indicators by the CBD, as well as other indicators that were used in the past or have not been used by the CBD. The top indicators are shown here, the red list, as well as genetic resources known or preserved ex situ. Unfortunately, these indicators of genetic status are known to be not well connected to genetic diversity change or status. They are probably used primarily because of easy data availability and that these indicators are currently recommended or have been by the CBD in the past. They're also probably commonly used because of the importance of agriculture, both to Target 13 and to countries' food security. These are less commonly found indicators, especially metrics from genetic studies or measures of how countries are preserving indigenous and local knowledge or developing strategies for conserving genetic diversity, even though that's a core element of the Target 13. So fewer than 5% of countries are reporting genetic data measurements and efforts to conserve local and indigenous knowledge of genetic diversity. This is probably because there are no currently recognized CBD indicators on these aspects of genetic diversity, and it's hard to find and compile data on them currently. In terms of actions, these are some actions countries could be taking to conserve genetic diversity. The majority of countries are reporting actions related to breeding or research agencies, seed banks, and other gene banks, and laws or policy. Similar to the indicators, actions are not focused on genetic diversity assessment or monitoring, and there's also relatively few actions on training and education. So some studies, certainly far from many studies, are doing countries are doing genetic studies, and very, very few countries are monitoring change in genetic diversity over time. These limitations might be due to limited capacity, knowledge, or other funding constraints. In terms of types of species, these are some different categories of species. The most commonly reported types of species are crops and farmed animals, followed by species of conservation concern, forestry, logging, fisheries, and crop wild relatives, followed by other species of importance. Genetic diversity is not mentioned very much for these kinds of species. We find that the importance of genetic diversity is not recognized in equal amount for all species. Definite emphasis on agricultural species, then other economically important species or threatened species, followed by other species, including those important for culture, ecosystem services, or other values. Those are not mentioned very often with genetic diversity. We have a few recommendations to improve how much and the quality of genetic diversity reporting in national reports based on our findings. We first, there's a need to continue knowledge sharing and awareness about the importance of genetic diversity. So via education, networking, conferences, connecting scientists to policymakers, and other capacity building efforts. There's a couple references. We also support suggestions for improvements to the CBD 0 draft, including altered wording for the genetic goal, a action target focused on genetic diversity, specifically focusing on including all species, and emphasizing evolutionary processes and adaptation. We also support 3 recently recommended pragmatic indicators for which data is currently available on genetic diversity. They're not perfect, but they should reflect genetic diversity conservation more than the currently used CBD indicators. So we think these are pragmatic and feasible indicators post-2020. We also, to improve comparison of national reports across time, think that we need a few changes to the guidance and structure of national reports, including potentially including lists of conservation genetic actions that is provided as a standard list to all countries, and then they can just kind of check off or report on those they've completed. And then we also think the guidance or instructions should include the different categories of species that are important, and emphasizing that countries should report on the status, threats, and actions for each category of species. So agricultural, other economically important species, culturally important species, threatened species, and other potential categories of species to ensure that each kind of species is reported on, not just primarily agricultural. We hope that such recommendations can lead to national reports in the future that have a higher amount and quality of genetic diversity of reporting, especially regarding non-agricultural species, reporting of genetic diversity metrics and measures and pragmatic indicators, and the inclusion of efforts for preserving traditional and local knowledge about genetic diversity. So thank you. We include here some contact information. Thank you very much.